I was sent to a very unpleasant school just after the war, and the only compensation was that every third Sunday in the winter they used to show silent films. Now, I had never seen a proper film before anyway, so it was fascinating to come to cinema through the films of my parents' generation. And I was fascinated by Harold Lloyd and Charles Chaplin and so on, and begged my parents to give me a projector. The only thing is I forgot to say movie projector, and so for Christmas when I was 10 I received a still projector, and the frustration of having a film strip with still images. But the next Christmas I got the real thing with a handle on the side, and it was a moving picture projector, but only 2 tiny films. And so I went out into the streets of London looking for more, and made a major discovery in a street off Baker Street, a pile of 9.5 films, and I took them home, and the first one was missing the front, so I didn't know what it was or who was in it. And my mother recognized Douglas Fairbanks, her favorite actor of the silent era. And hearing that was extremely exciting. And I wanted to know more about it. And in my ignorance, I went to the local library thinking it would have film books. Well, by a miracle, it had one, a French book, oddly enough, called History of the Film by Bardèche and Brassillac. And I thought it would fall open at a picture from my film telling me what it was called and having a description. And that's exactly what happened. It fell open at a picture of Douglas Fairbanks in my film, and there was a paragraph about its importance in the cinema. And I thought, well, if I've got a film that's in a book, I'd better find some more. And this turned me into an ardent collector. And the more I found, the more excited I got. And the more I spoke to friends, they said, silent films, there's a waste of time. They're badly photographed, the acting's ridiculous, the stories are stupid. And there was this tremendous prejudice against them. And so I became a kind of evangelist for silent films, showing people what they looked like, and it was very rewarding. In 60 years ago, this January, I was at home from school with flu, and I had bought a film by another French director who'd better be nameless, because he's one of the pets of the intellectuals, which I thought was god-awful. And I rang up the film library that I bought it from, and I said, have you got anything I could exchange this for? And they said, there's only one film left. It's called Napoleon Bonaparte and the French Revolution. I said, that's going to be a classroom film full of static engravings and paintings and masses of text. They said, it's all we've got. I said, okay, send it over. And I remember calling the British Film Institute and saying, do you have a review of a film about Napoleon, silent film? And they looked it up and they said, well, all we've got is one by Abel Gance, they pronounced it. And I said, well, it might be that one. What do they say about it? And they said, well, it's not a very good review. It says the figure of Bonaparte struts around with all the futile bombast of a turkey cock. And I said, well, it's on its way, there's nothing I can do. Well, it arrived. I made a miraculous recovery from my flu, showed the film to my parents, and my God, what a picture. It was the most extraordinary use of cinema I had ever seen. It was what I dreamt the cinema should be, but had never seen an example of it. And if any of you have the time, after this is over, we could run 5 minutes of it on the screen, because it really is exceptional. Even today, if you saw that sort of treatment, in 2014, you'd say, good God. So I was so impressed, I wrote a fan letter to this fellow that made it, who I'd never heard of, Abel Gantz, and sent it care of the Cinémathèque Française, hoping it would get to him somehow. And it did. I got an answer from him. So now I'm getting more excited, and I meet Liam O'Leary, who is a friend of mine who was the assistant curator of the National Film Archive. And he introduced me to a journalist, Francis Caval, who says, oh yes, I've met him, and lent me a photograph. And my God, he looked great, you know, he looked at the face of a medieval saint. And I showed this to Liam O'Leary, and this is the bit you won't believe. A few weeks later, he looked through the glass door of his office and saw the man in the photograph. And he walked out and said, "Êtes-vous Monsieur Gans?" And Gans was amazed to be recognized because he hadn't worked in the cinema for 12 years. And a reception was arranged for that evening, and Liam rang my mother and said, "You've got to get Kevin out of school over to the National Film Theatre." And she did. She spoke with a very funereal tone to the headmaster, who thought somebody had died in the family, because why else would she be ringing a boarding school, a day school, which this was. And they let me go without question. And I met my idol, and he, unfortunately for me, I hadn't spent enough attention on French classes, and he hadn't on English classes, so we had to have a translator. But it was a very emotional meeting, and I'll never forget it. And it was a friendship that lasted for the rest of his life, and impelled me, when I saw the version of Napoleon, I had already acquired more on 9.5 to show me that a lot was missing from the Cinémathèque's version of Napoleon. I spent 25 years finding the rest of it, although it's still not complete, and I hear that the Cinémathèque Française is now restoring it. Well, as a collector, I went for anything just to see what it was like. And Grass, what a peculiar title. I have no idea what this was, but it was a tinted print from the 1920s, cut down to 4 reels, which would have run under the hour, but it had all the major sequences. And everybody I showed it to was tremendously impressed with it, but none more than this vicar in the country village where my mother lived. I showed it at Christmas to his congregation, and he was desperate to get hold of the print. He thought it was an amazing film, which indeed it is. What it shows is astonishing, although the way it's shot is very simple. The more I met, I remember one person saying, "That is the greatest expression of the human spirit I've ever seen." And the more I showed this picture and the more excitement it aroused, the more I wanted to meet the people that made it. And when I went to America, I managed to meet Cooper, which was a very impressive fellow. And then when I returned, I managed to meet Schoedsack, and we used to go, my wife and I used to go to dinner with the Schoedsacks almost every week while we were out there. And he was even more entertaining than Cooper because he was so funny. And in fact, he did a send-up of King Kong on a long-playing gramophone record. I mean, it's fascinating. Then I found out more about Cooper's life. And do you know about his World War activities? It's incredible. And just recently I discovered that when he was shot down in Russia during the Russo-Polish War of 1920, he was interrogated by Isaac Babel, and his book Red Cavalry has a description of interviewing somebody called Frank Mosher, which was the name that was on Cooper's underwear. And Cooper pretended that's who he was. And it's absolutely fascinating. And Red Cavalry is generally regarded as the finest work of fiction to come out, a work of literature to come out of Soviet Russia. Oh, well, first of all, he made you convinced that the idea was brilliant. Yeah. At least he made David O. Selznick convinced, nobody else was. And then he delivered the result, which was more than almost anybody on earth could do, because you had to find out how to make that film. You can't make a picture about a gorilla and hire one from the zoo and show him the script. He pulled it off to a fantastic degree. Really, it's much more astonishing than you think when you watch it now, because we're so used to animation. Willis O'Brien, he had started doing animation many years before. The Ghost of Slumber Mountain was one of his first films, about 1916. But his great, absolutely sensational feature was called The Lost World. Now, Conan Doyle wrote The Lost World, and it's a story of a group of explorers who get stuck on a plateau where there are prehistoric animals. And here's the problem. You can shoot all the stuff with the explorers. You can shoot the plateau, but how do you shoot dinosaurs that convince an audience? And O'Brien did a test which he showed to Conan Doyle, who took it to the Conference of American Magicians. And he told them the story of the Lost World as if it was true. And he said, I saw these prehistoric animals myself, and I have a motion picture camera with me, and I'm now going to show you what I saw. And every one of them was convinced that he was telling the truth. So they then embarked on Lost World as a feature. And at the end, as though he was being directed by Merian Cooper, he had the Brontosaurus, I think it was, escaping from the Natural History Museum and rampaging through the streets of London. And that turned Cooper crazy to do his King Kong rampaging through the streets of Manhattan. Willis O'Brien was a very, as you can imagine, driven individual. He was, I believe, an alcoholic, because whenever he got stuck, he would get drunk, and Cooper had to go down and sort him out and bail him out. And also, he had a terrible tragedy when his wife went mad and shot his two sons. Oh, awful. And that was around the time he was doing Son of Kong. And, I mean, he had to put up with the worst situation a man can face. But anyhow, he did a simply tremendous job, and Cooper would go down and act the part of Kong so that O'Brien could animate it. And if you see this film I made called I'm King Kong, you'll see how it's animated. Cooper said that he would make anything that was distant, difficult, and dangerous. And that is really an inspiration. When I've never had the courage to make a proper Cooper film, going abroad to some unknown part of the world, but I would love to have done so. My grandfather was in sailing ships, and my greatest ambition was to have been on sailing ships. I don't want to do it, but I would love to be able to say I served 2 years before the mast on a square rigger. He wouldn't, but he should have, because he did Grass, which was, I think, a better picture than Nanook of the North, and he did Chang, which is the opposite to Grass. Everything was staged, but it's an absolutely brilliant picture. And above all, he was John Ford's producer in one of his richest periods, and aside from anything else, he helped win the war in the Far East against the Japanese, which one forgets. Oh, and he was behind Cinerama, so it's an unbelievable CV, isn't it? Even if you don't have Kong and all the rest of them there. It was always received with acclamation, particularly, unfortunately, by Adolf Hitler, whose favorite film it was. He had two favorite films, The Lives of a Bengal Lancer, and The Lives of a Bengal Lancer, the second unit material, shot in India, was shot by Ernest Schoedsack. And King Kong, well, you can imagine who he identified with. I've always skipped over. There's so much to deal with on King Kong. I've never investigated Max Steiner. The music is an essential part of it all. If you ever, I keep forgetting to mention that it was such a slow production because of all the animation that Cooper put Schoedsack on directing another picture on the same sets, called The Most Dangerous Game, also with Max Steiner. And it's a very frightening picture, very thrilling. But Max Steiner must have been short of time, because his theme goes dum da da dum 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 da da dum 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 da da dum all the way through the picture. I don't know how he got away with it. But now the thing is that the following year, all the really violent stuff in Kong was cut by Hayes. It would never have got off the ground with the Hayes Code in existence, absolutely not. I know there was a scene on a log in which the characters are being shaken off it by Kong, and they scream down into the abyss. But I can't remember the other censored sequences. Oh, when he's taking the costume off Fay Ray, yes, that's another one. But it's mostly the violence that was and the violence was absolutely terrifying for 1933. It is pretty terrifying now for kids, I should think. Well, funnily enough, the English had just introduced an H certificate for horror films, but Kong was, I think, came out before that, I still think it would have worked perfectly well with as it did with the censor cuts, they went a bit far for that era.
Yes. Okay. So that's it.
Okay. Thanks very much. Right. Thank you.